One of the central elements of your book is the idea of violence and the important role that violence played. And you make the point that there was the threat of violence from Ulster, which put a stop to the Home Rule Bill, in effect, coming into force. And yet there's this countervailing threat of violence from nationalism. So do you come to have some sympathy for Asquith in his predicament?
Well, Asquith, from his point of view, you could say when the First World War breaks out that Asquith has achieved what he wanted to achieve. He hasn't lost his job as Prime Minister. Unlike Gladstone, he's held the Liberal Party together. It hasn't split. He's brought a united country into the First World War. And he has avoided the outbreak of violence in Ireland, at least for the time being. You could say, well, it hasn't happened on his watch. I mean, that would be his thinking. And that was his argument.
And as you say in the book, the outbreak of war allowed him to do what he wanted to do about Ireland, which was nothing.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, his reaction to the outbreak of the war is quite extraordinary. He exchanged letters with Venetia Stanley, who was his closest confidant. Opinion is divided upon whether or not they were actually lovers. But he, and unfortunately, he destroyed her letters to him. But we can get something. There's an extraordinary letter where he quotes one of his letters to him, and therefore that particular phrase survived. And when the First World War breaks out, he said, what you say about cutting off your head being a very good way of getting rid of a headache. And cutting off your head is the First World War, and the headache is Ireland. And he realizes once the First World War began that Ireland doesn't count for anything.
And the Suspension Act, which they bring in, what does that do?
What the Suspension Act does is the compromise that was struck, and it was a compromise which Redmond asked for and encouraged. Redmond said, provided that the Home Rule Bill would be enacted in the form in which it was introduced. In other words, there would be no partitionist element in the Act that was based on the statute book. But it would accompany by a suspensory act, which meant it wouldn't come into effect until 12 months after the end of the war. So, in effect, Asquith, I mean, I think if Redmond had held out, I think Redmond could have probably got a Home Rule Parliament in the summer of 1914. It wouldn't have been a Home Rule Parliament for all of Ireland, but it would have been a Home Rule Parliament with perhaps temporary, perhaps permanent exclusion of Ulster. But he would have had something, he would have had some power, he would have had a parliament, he would have had patronage. As it was, he had nothing. And of course, what he didn't realize and what nobody realized was how appalling the war was going to be and how, in particular, how protracted it was going to be, how long it was going to go on.
So Redmond has struck a deal with Asquith, and he then goes on to controversially encourage nationalists to join up and go to wherever the firing line extends. So how important is that? I mean, the unionists, Carson, seem to get some kudos from the British establishment for their help. Redmond seems to get very little.
Well, Redmond, you see, Redmond was offered a place in the cabinet 2 or 3 times, but he turned it down. And what Redmond said about Irish volunteers should go wherever the firing line extends. At first, that was very popular in Ireland because when the war begins, it's popular all over Europe. People all over Europe are charging to join up. They can't join up quickly enough. And as long as Redmond's calculation was that the war would be over quickly, because the last war to take place in Europe, the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, was very short-lived. People didn't realize that wasn't the real analogy. The real analogy was with the American Civil War, where, you know, industrial might, technology, all these, the horrors that these could visit upon battlefields were being introduced for the first time. And of course, it was infinitely worse in the trenches on the Western Front. So Redmond could be forgiven if you like, you might say he took a gamble, and the gamble did not pay off.